Dear guests, welcome to the 2022 John Holmes Memorial Lecture. As we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. We recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. Glendon, as part of York University, acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. La région connue comme Toronto a été préservée par la nation Anishinaabe, la Confédération Haudenosaunee et les Hurons-Wendat. Elle est désormais le foyer d'un grand nombre de communautés des Premières Nations, Inuits et Métis. Nous reconnaissons les titulaires actuels du traité, la Première Nation des Mississaugas de Credit. Ce territoire est soumis au traité de la ceinture Wampum, Dish with One Spoon, entente définissant le partage et la préservation pacifique de la région des Grands Lacs. In this event, simultaneous interpretation in French, Spanish, and Chinese is provided by Glendon's graduate students from the Master of Conference Interpreting program. Audience members will see a globe icon at the bottom of their webinar page. If they click on it, they will see all the language options offered and simply need to click on the one they wish to listen to. Questions can also be asked at any time during the event using the webinar's Q&A function, also found at the bottom of the webinar page. At the end of the event, we will announce the 10 lucky winners who will be receiving a complimentary copy of Nahlah Ayed's book, 1,000 Farewells, A Reporter's Journey from Refugee Camp to the Arab Spring, as part of our registration book giveaway. And now, I introduce to you Principal Marco Fiola, who will make the opening remarks.
Merci, Monsieur le Directeur du département d'études internationales. Bonjour tout le monde, good day, Annie, bonjour. C'est à mon tour de vous souhaiter la bienvenue virtuellement à Glendon et par le fait même à l'Université York. Je suis ravi de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui pour cette discussion très importante et aussi, malheureusement, une discussion qui est très opportune, étant donné la crise géopolitique dans laquelle le monde est plongé depuis quelques jours. If I may, allow me to say a few words about the Glendon, specifically for the benefit of those joining us today for the first time. Simply put, Glendon is the bilingual faculty of York University. Founded over 50 years ago, Glendon's mission is rooted in the liberal arts and multilingualism. Sorry, I'm having trouble with that word today, but it doesn't stop there. Since its creation, Glendon has paved the way in seeking to promote leadership on the local, national, and international scale. We strongly believe that education is key to respond to society's current and future needs, which is why we prioritize liberal arts programming while being committed to sciences, business, and communication, among other fields of study and research. Nous aimons dire que nous sommes un petit collège, un petit campus, si vous le voulez aussi, avec un grand cœur, et que Glendon parle au monde. En effet, nous pensons que l'apprentissage dans un environnement multiculturel fournit un ensemble inestimable de compétences transférables. Dans une communauté diversifiée, accueillante et inclusive, les langues sont indispensables pour communiquer et pour s'écouter véritablement les uns les autres. Nous croyons que l'apprentissage d'une autre langue sert au développement de l'empathie et des compétences interculturelles qui sont au cœur de notre mission. I'm going to stop here, though, as I know you're all, like me, attending today's event to hear from one of Canada's most respected foreign correspondents. Having watched Ms. Ayed for many years on CBC when she was based in Beirut in London, and now listening to her on CBC Radio, it always struck me how genuine and personal her reporting was and is. In watching and listening to her, one felt that they had a better understanding of the issues, but also a better understanding of how those issues impacted people. Day after day, she was the voice of those affected. She brought them to the living rooms of the nation. And in return, she was our eyes and ears on the ground. Today, as we watch live reports and are deeply saddened by the situation in Ukraine. We're honored to have with us someone who has not only seen the dangers firsthand of being on the ground in the middle of a conflict, but also someone who knows all too well the challenge of distinguishing fact from fiction. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech et bienvenue.
Thank you, Principal Fiola. In 1989, three Glendon graduates, Marshall Leslie, Jim Doe, and Martin Shadwick, who is currently a faculty member at Glendon, collaborated with Professor Edward Epathurai and Principal Albert Tucker in the launching of a lecture series in honor of John Holmes, who had died the previous year. Mr. Holmes had taught at Glendon College from 1971 to 81 a course on Canadian foreign and defense policy, in which he imparted to them and other equally enthusiastic students his insights, critiques, and analysis of our country's external relations. In addition to having served in the Canadian Diplomatic Service and at the National Defense College in Canada, Mr. Holmes had also been from 1960 to 1973 Director General of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, whose quarters had been for a time located at Glendon College. The creators of the lecture series wanted to honor John Holmes' tradition of intellectual inquiry by inviting leading personalities in the public sector or in public life to discuss contemporary problems in their own area of endeavor. Since this lecture series began, 30 speakers have caught the imagination of their audiences, challenged them intellectually, and sought to make sense of this complex world of ours. 7 speakers were diplomats, including the first speaker in the series, the late Sir Brian Urquhart, who was Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Other speakers are the late Vincent Del Buono of Amnesty International, Lieutenant General Senator Romeo Dallaire, a think tank analyst and federal cabinet minister, and 3 academics, among them Margaret Macmillan of Oxford University and Cindy Blackstock of McGill University. We also find the former Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, the former Senator and Master of Massey College, the Honorable Hugh Segal, the Archbishop of Toronto, His Eminence Thomas Cardinal Collins, and the well-known broadcasting personality, Peter Manbridge of the CBC. Today's speaker is Nahlah Ayed. Nahlah Ayed, currently host of CBC Radio 1's Ideas, is also an award-winning veteran of foreign reporting. First in the Middle East, where she spent nearly a decade covering the region's many conflicts, and later, while based in London, she covered many of the major stories of our time: Russia's annexation of Crimea, Europe's refugee crisis, the Brexit vote and its fallout. Ancienne journaliste parlementaire pour la presse canadienne, Nahlah est diplômée du programme de maîtrise en journalisme de l'Université Carleton. Elle détient également une maîtrise en études interdisciplinaires, philosophie, anglais et sciences, et un baccalauréat et sciences en génétique de l'Université de Manitoba. I introduce to you Nahlah Ayed.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Merci beaucoup, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real privilege to be with you today and a real honor to deliver the annual John W. Holmes Lecture. Thank you for inviting me to help continue this tradition and to be part of your efforts to carry on his very important legacy. It feels both fitting and somewhat odd for me to speak to you about foreign reporting today from Toronto, while many of my colleagues, and of course, millions of Ukrainians, are literally under Russian fire in Kyiv and elsewhere in Ukraine. J'espère que mes propos d'aujourd'hui contribueront à souligner l'importance de la plus récente mission de ces correspondants et à souligner l'importance d'être témoin de la tragédie qui frappe les Ukrainiens une fois de plus. My first story today also begins in Ukraine on a sunny morning, almost exactly 8 years ago this month. I was standing among a group of journalists, many of them foreign, at a military base in Crimea. Crimea at that point was all but lost to Ukraine, annexed by Russia. And unbeknownst to us, that act was just the start of an entirely new conflict. At the same time, there was word of unusual activity elsewhere in eastern Ukraine, to be specific, in the Donbass region. There were protests happening by apparently pro-Russian citizens, and we were under some pressure to get there. But that day on that base, there was another story unfolding that was worth watching. Like many other Ukrainian military personnel in Crimea, Yulia Mamchur had been ordered by Russian forces to abandon his base and to hand it over. But he refused. And he refused to leave the Belbek Air Base where he was in charge because he said, "I won't move," he said, "without an order from above." There were many Ukrainians leaving, military and civilians alike. I remember interviewing some of them on a train platform, whole families and many young people who said they didn't want to be Russian or to live under Russian rule. They were Ukrainians. And so after the local parliament unexpectedly held a vote on joining Russia while we were there, after local and foreign journalists had been threatened, beaten up, and roughed up, after masked gunmen had taken over a local television station and shut it down, after bank machines started to run out of money, many people made the drastic decision to pull up stakes and to leave. Meanwhile, the Russian disinformation machine was in overdrive, as it is in today's conflict. Trolls and bots sowed confusion and blurred lines, at once denying Russian involvement and claiming Crimeans themselves were demanding to join Russia, and at the same time, selling the idea that Crimea was being held hostage by neo-Nazis in Kyiv. So my reporting on the Exodus was immediately questioned online, a feature that was just starting to become business as usual in my work. I had to be making this up, I was told, or surely I was being lied to. But I was there on the ground. I had met these people and spoke to them. I saw them with my very own eyes get on trains and leave. But not Colonel Mamchur. He chose to make a stand, despite assertions from the local government that after that vote they held, Ukrainian soldiers were now occupiers who should either surrender or walk away. Still, given how things were going in the rest of Crimea, it was only a matter of time, really, before Mamchur and his men would be removed. Of course, we wanted to stay to see that. We wanted to bear witness. But the clock was ticking and the sun was setting, and we had been assigned to drive all the way to Donetsk to see about those protests. And so reluctantly, after waiting a few hours on the base and with nothing really happening, we left. We made the long journey, the long drive all the way to Donetsk. Sure enough, a few hours later, with gunfire and grenades, Russian troops rolled into the Belbek Air Base, and the colonel was ousted along with his men. And he subsequently went missing for days. In Donetsk, we arrived and watched a new conflict in its infancy, a conflict that upended and claimed countless lives for 8 long years, laying the groundwork for the events that are unfolding in Ukraine today. With every armed confrontation, with every revolution, every political conflict, and especially with every senseless act of violence, and there were a few of those during my time, both in the Middle East and in Europe, the bombings, the shooting rampages, the candlelight vigils, the endless candlelight vigils. The question would always come back to me with a dull, throbbing persistence. What is the lesson? Maintenant, avec un certain recul entre moi et ces événements, la question s'est élargie. Y a-t-il des leçons à tirer de la couverture des événements mondiaux au cours des 20 premières années de ce siècle? Beyond the fact that peace is an unnatural state in our world, beyond the fact that humans can do unspeakable things to each other, and beyond the fact that history stubbornly keeps repeating itself. Stories, we're told, are our best means for learning about ourselves, about our challenges, our weaknesses, our condition, and our future. If nothing else, A foreign correspondent is a storyteller, and in particular, the teller of other people's stories. And for me, with a deliberate intention to promote understanding. In my experience, they were often tragic stories, sometimes heartbreaking stories. And that alone will undoubtedly color any conclusions I might come to about the state of our world right now. For one, I'll tell you that more often than not, those stories I was telling revolved around two main protagonists, us and them. Since the start of this century, I came to know us and them quite well, perhaps more than I ever wanted. I watched up close as the century opened with violence, giving new life and more ammunition to us and them. I watched as together, us and them made history, usually the darkest sort of history. That too set the tone for much of the rest of my career abroad. And as the years wore on, I watched as political conflict and economic downturn inevitably devolved into stories of us and them. Even more disturbingly, I watched as political forces increasingly encouraged that tendency whenever life got a little less comfortable. The other, therefore, featured quite prominently in my stories as well. A bit deeper into the century, us and them have grown increasingly at odds. I don't have to tell you that, it's apparent. And they're at odds over the fundamentals, over basic facts, over science, over climate change, over vaccines, over just what goodness is, over what democracy is, over how best to ensure equality, fairness, and how best to address past wrongs. Now, it is still a very young century. It's too early to come to any definitive conclusions about just what kind of century this will turn out to be. But from my privileged perch, from my particular lens, and no doubt colored by the events that are happening right now, I do have a few observations I'd like to share with you. The first is that one way or another, and increasingly so, every war happening on the world stage right now is everyone's war. It isn't only because wars, as always, can wreak havoc with the markets, bring asylum seekers to our borders, or raise the price of oil, or in this current war, we're witnessing the price of bread. And it isn't just because there are Canadians whose happiness and welfare due to their heritage are dependent on the outcome of these seemingly faraway wars. Every war is our war too, even those that don't involve directly Canadians, because we are of the modern world. And the modern world is just that interlinked, and in more ways than ever. Take the Yemen war, for instance, Yemen, an ongoing conflict where 13 million people are, as we speak, at risk of starvation because the contributions to the World Food Programme are failing to meet the huge demand. Yemen, of course, is a proxy war, and that makes it a story not just about Yemen, but it's also about Iran and Saudi Arabia and their rivalry. And so already its significance bleeds well beyond Yemen's borders. But it should also be a Canadian story, given that Canada sells arms and military vehicles to Saudi Arabia. And that Canadian-made sniper rifles, for example, as we first discovered in an investigation a few years ago, have ended up in the hands of Houthi fighters, presumably after they were captured on the battlefield. The Yemen war also qualified as a Canadian story when it became known that thanks to Citizen Lab, that a Canadian internet filtering company was helping to block internet content at the behest of the Houthis. Now, widen the lens just a little bit and take the so-called People's War on Terror in China, where the very technology used to harvest data and surveil the population of Xinjiang province 24/7 is and was, of course, born in the computer labs of Silicon Valley and the West, The same technology, by the way, that is also being used to monitor our behavior and activities for profit. Every war is everyone's war also because, thanks to social media and online funding platforms, in today's conflicts, any kind of conflict, opinions and dollars can also be weaponized and shot across borders, literally changing facts on the ground. You don't need to look further than the events in Ottawa recently for evidence of the potency of such efforts, most obviously from our neighbors to the south. Though you could also look a little bit further back at the online meddling in the 2016 election in the US that expanded the list of combatants of that political battle to include Moscow. And then there's the current crisis that for the first time in years has starkly underlined that interconnectedness for people around the world. I'll never forget a few years ago riding on a bus tour with Russian opposition activists in London on what they called the kleptocracy tour of London, in which they pointed out all the pricey properties that belong to Putin's cronies and still belong to Putin's cronies. Today, in light of the Ukraine conflict, such links are further proof of how a war way over there has fronts everywhere. But like so many people today, I personally came away from nearly 2 decades of covering conflict, believing that at minimum, every war is everyone's war because we live, we exist while humans kill other humans before our very eyes. That alone should hold our attention. In 2018, I visited Sweden just after authorities had reissued a Cold War era pamphlet, updated and aimed at preparing the public for possible crisis or war. When it was unveiled, it made headlines around the world. Sweden is, after all, just downwind from Russia. There has been reason for it to be concerned. But the real headline was the head-turning edition on page 4, under the heading, "Be on the lookout for false information." This is a quote directly from the pamphlet. States and organizations are already using misleading information in order to try and influence our values and how we act, it reads. And with that, Sweden became one of the first nations in the world to directly warn its citizens about the perils of disinformation in the modern age. Notwithstanding the return of conventional war to Europe now and the threat of its escalation, what Sweden was pointing out was that one of this century's most dangerous weapons is disinformation and misinformation. It's what I came away with after years in foreign reporting too. That's because misinformation and the more deliberate disinformation intersect with every one of the threats we collectively face right now, with climate change, with this pandemic and the next one, and with the erosion of democracy. Simply put, misinformation can kill. And it doesn't only kill human beings, though that alone is shocking. Misinformation is killing democracy, it's killing journalism, it's killing our trust and our spirit, while breathing new life into the story of us and them. Let me give you an example. I have seen many refugee camps in my life, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of what has been described as the world's largest refugee camp in Kutupalong in Bangladesh. Driving in, you literally feel the world closing in. It's hard to breathe, it's hard to move. It's hard to imagine how suffocating it would be, and unfortunate to call it home. It was 2017, and the unprecedented size of this forced migration made it a standout in my mind and the minds of others, of course. But there were other things that hinted at its uniqueness. Among their few belongings, many of the fleeing Rohingya Muslims crossing the border on foot carried these little solar panels with which they can charge their phones. And on those phones, many of them had videos and pictures to tell the story, to tell us the story of the campaign that killed and uprooted thousands and destroyed dozens of their villages. This was a 21st century refugee crisis. And so it should have come as no surprise that social media might have played a role in what had become of them, and specifically disinformation on social media. Later reporting by the New York Times and Reuters, as well as UN human rights investigators, revealed that the very technology often celebrated for connecting us had been systematically used by hundreds of Myanmar military personnel working in shifts to incite genocidal acts, that it had for years served as a platform for a military-led campaign of hate, misleading and dehumanizing content targeting Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Facebook, or Meta, as the parent company is now known, has now been accused in a multi-billion-dollar class action lawsuit of not only failing to remove such content from its platform in Myanmar, but also of encouraging it and allowing its algorithms to amplify it. In a business model we now all know too well that thrives on getting to know users and then serving up whatever it is that they like in the name of profit. After all, in the online world, as we're often told, we are the product. With misinformation and disinformation, we also risk being the victims. In India, viral rumors about strangers slipping into neighborhoods to abduct children turned messaging apps meant to keep our friends and families close into staging grounds for the lynchings of other people's innocent children. They've also served as platforms for viral messaging that helps whip up distrust of minorities. In a country with a long history of communal violence, such messaging, sometimes driven by political figures and parties, can be incendiary, and it can cost lives. Dans le monde entier, la désinformation tuait également la confiance de moins pour certains segments de la population et remet en question l'autorité de vrai journalisme responsable, redevable, juste et précis. We live in an information ecosystem that effectively holds that if nothing is true, then anything is possible. This is happening at a time when perhaps more than ever, the availability of good journalism is a crucial indicator of the health of a democracy and a first line of defense for keeping the powerful and would-be demagogues in check. In that ecosystem, again polluted by social media and its algorithms, traditional journalism is held in contempt as not fast enough, not opinionated enough, or maybe too opinionated or driven by some kind of an agenda. Our reporting is questioned at every turn, and that's good. We too, especially in public broadcasting, must be held accountable. But far too often, and increasingly so, these are not reasoned critiques based on content. Today, harassment and bullying, once only the privilege of journalists like me working abroad, is becoming more and more common on our streets. Who would have thought you'd need police protection to report live from Ottawa? And that's besides the name calling and horrific threats directed at journalists online, especially women and especially minorities. Watching this materialize over several years in other places, I have no doubt that the rise of misinformation and disinformation are to blame. And to find out where all of this could lead, just take a look at countries where misinformation has been rife for years and where real journalism is either sidelined or entirely absent. Not surprisingly, that list includes places like Russia. That brings me to another conclusion that I've repeatedly come to in assignment after assignment, that to understand our world is to understand ourselves. You remember 2015, the real-time images of asylum seekers in boats pulling up on the beaches and walking to major capitals around Europe. You'll also remember the picture of young Alan Kurdi lying on the beach, face down and alone, as if just for a little rest. But he had drowned along with his family as their inflatable boat capsized off the shore off of Turkey. The boat they had hoped was the start of their journey to join family here in Canada. Those images elicited strong reactions around the world, as they did here. They served at once to remind Canadians of our past, to mobilize us in the present, and to hint at what might still come in our future. Ces images nous ont rappelé le type de désespoir qui a façonné ce pays dans ses premières années. Les réfugiés irlandais les plus démunis arrivant ici pour fuir la grande famine irlandaise au milieu du 19e siècle. Les Vietnamiens fuyaient la guerre et arrivaient ici sur les bateaux. Et les Juifs à bord de Saint-Louis qui ont échappé à la menace nazie et qui cherchaient aussi la sécurité, mais qui ont été refoulés en 1939. Nous avions besoin qu'on nous rappelle tout cela. We needed to be reminded of all of that. And so all those stories came back to life in 2015 as thousands of Canadians came forward to help with donations, with time, even space in their homes. Among them were private citizens, mosques, churches, synagogues, and many Vietnamese Canadians who signed up specifically to privately sponsor Syrian refugees, just as many others did for the very first time in Canadian history when Vietnamese refugees needed help. Such acts were acts of hope, though at the same time, that crisis amplified the voices of those who would also say today, none is too many. As for the future, those stories in 2015 told us what was yet to come. The people who would increasingly seek safety by walking across our own borders. Those stories braced us to the extent that we can be braced for the horror of discovering a young family freezing to death on the Manitoba-US border at the start of this year. At countless points over the past 20 years, I imagined the world kind of like holding up a mirror. In the growing chaos and hate of anti-democratic movements elsewhere, in the rise of misinformation, I saw warnings, and I understood that we too were not immune. In the endless stories of poverty and injustice, I always saw our privilege and the incongruousness of the poverty and injustice we have here at home. In the countless stories of conflict and war, I saw how easily we take peace for granted. And as a result, all along, I understood the need to lend our attention. And so that leads me to a related conclusion. That indifference to what happens in the world is simply not an option. We can't afford to be indifferent. It's a matter of our own survival, but it's also a matter of the kind of world we want to live in. Injustice anywhere should be an affront to all of us. And the minimum action required is so little. Carol Off, once a foreign correspondent herself, and until yesterday, longtime host of CBC's As It Happens, recently put it better than I ever could. So I'll just quote her. She said, "Just stay engaged, stay there. Stay there in the world, don't leave it. Not because you need to be there, but other people need you to be there. Other people need you to just bear witness. Just bear witness to the struggles of others. That's as much as the world can ask of you. That's as much as the world can ask of you. As for the journalists who bring you those stories, bearing witness, of course, is a kind of like a middle name. It's at the very heart of what they do. So let me talk a little bit about the key lessons I've distilled on how we should be doing that better. Being there is what compelled a group of us to make an insane trip, a 2-day journey in convoy to witness the arrival of American troops in Baghdad. It's what compelled us to drive the old Silk Road toward Jalalabad as American forces pursued bin Laden just days after another group of foreign journalists were captured and killed on that road trying to do the same. Bearing witness has meant riding a ship near the Libyan waters for 9 days in search of migrants at sea. It's meant being there day in and day out when nothing was happening in Beirut. Being there now for the journalists who are hunkered down in Ukraine means risking their lives to bear witness to this century's latest war. Their presence there means you, me, and all of us are incredibly well served. But as any news organization will tell you, foreign reporting is expensive and increasingly prohibitively so. And as any foreign correspondent will tell you, reporting from abroad is rarely done alone. So that brings me to another lesson I've learned along the way, is that it takes a village to tell the modern world stories. No foreign correspondent can do their work without the producers, the editors, the photographers or videographers, either on the ground or back at home, who help to get it online, to bring it to air. And no foreign correspondent can do their work without the insight and expertise of the people on the ground who know their story best, be they local journalists or translators or drivers and guides, and of course, the ordinary people who are living the consequences of upheaval and strife. Despite all of that, this is an incredibly difficult profession. The demands on today's foreign journalist are crushing. It's partly why I left it. The information ecosystem makes it harder to do the job well. The security challenges are increasing. The toll it takes is very real. So while I'm sitting here before you defending foreign journalism, I will say that the traditional model of reporting from abroad is not sustainable in the long term. What I've concluded after nearly 2 decades of doing it is that international storytelling requires an update for a most difficult century. It needs to be more investigative. It needs to cover more terrain. We need more bureaus, not fewer. We need the resources and the time to cover the in-between times, to provide context, to revisit the history. We also need to see domestic news as global and vice versa. This is the century that finally globalized local news. The proof is in COVID, in climate change, the Me Too movement, the battle against misinformation, or the struggle for equality. These are global challenges playing out everywhere. And we can also do much better in providing a range of voices to tell those stories. We need not choose between the foreign correspondent who's flown in from abroad for her international experience and perspective, and the reporter hired locally for her lived experience, language skills, and intimate knowledge of her country. We need them both. We can work more collaboratively with local journalists to help enrich the stories we tell, to ensure their work is recognized and visible, and that they too are protected when the authorities or the growing army of critics threaten them and their families too, or as happened in Afghanistan, when they're left to fend for themselves as foreign forces withdrew, with no recourse, no support, and no way out. With newsroom resources dwindling and misinformation gathering strength, To understand the stories of our complex world today, we, citizens and journalists alike, need all the help we can get. Understanding the world is a collective effort. So that means we need the investigations increasingly taken on by respected aid groups and independent organizations dedicated to investigating wrongdoing. We need the observations of diplomats with eyes on the ground. We also depend on the citizen journalists, often armed with nothing more than a smartphone and good timing. We need all of it. What doesn't change is the need to center ordinary people, people whose lives and livelihoods are destroyed by events, the people who take the brunt of political instability and war, the people who want the world to hear their stories, the aggrieved, the underprivileged, and the wronged. We must show humility and willingness to learn as people tell us their stories. And we must always be motivated by the desire to promote understanding and to call out injustice in the most accurate, fair, and balanced way possible. The last couple of observations that I will share with you here bring us back to wars. It's kind of in the air, and to some of those age-old lessons that they teach us, no matter the century. One is that peace, unfortunately, is an anomaly. There are parts of the world, of course, where that is a daily reality. Most Lebanese will immediately attest to that, and no wonder. I lived there for 5 years in that country. And even after the ravages of 15 years of civil war, every one of my years there brought assassinations, armed conflicts, and upheavals. But for much of the West, despite the obvious exceptions, the years since the world wars, we're told, have been among the most peaceful. Yet this century might be telling us a different story. Looking back now, Syria was unprecedented. The invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan were unprecedented. The ongoing troubles in Yemen, in the Central African Republic, and today, Ukraine's tragic story, they all teach us all over again that humans can do unspeakable things to each other, that history stubbornly keeps repeating itself, and that peace is not a given. It is not guaranteed, that things can change on a dime. It's a shocking reminder that even this far into an admittedly young but violent century, we still often take the peace we know for granted. But just so that near the end here, I can share at least one positive observation from my time abroad. I'll tell you about one thing that struck me in several war zones. And that is, you'll be surprised by this, that even in conflict, birds still sing. It's the most vivid memory, the first time that I noticed. It was a sunny, hot day, which started in a taxi in Amman in Jordan, and via Syria, via the back roads of Lebanon's mountains, the sleepy, tiny towns with the terracotta roofs, skirting the bomb bridges along the way, it ended on the front stoop of my apartment building near the Mediterranean Sea in Beirut, with the conflict in full swing. The bombing had fallen silent for a short spell, and the birds in the tree outside the house broke into song. I remember looking up at them and seeing them, and for the next several weeks, they helped me understand that even in humanity's darkest moments, there can be beauty to behold. And that for me, that opened the door to the idea that even during conflict and war, there are hopeful stories to be told. I just had to find them. Wars, as you've seen yourself in the past days, can bring out the best in people. I've seen people dig at rubble with their very own hands to try to save a life. I've seen people share what little food or drink they have with complete strangers. In various places, I've been taken into homes, given a bed, and kept safe by strangers. On March 2nd, exactly 18 years ago tomorrow, in the wake of a series of bombs that claimed nearly 100 lives before our eyes in Baghdad, I felt the tug of a man's hand pulling me from an angry crowd, and thereby saving my life, even when it could have cost him his. I am certain that I would not be sitting here before you today without his intervention. He taught me with that very small act that sometimes you have to reach across and help a stranger simply because it's the right thing to do. It was a hopeful act, a masterclass in answering the question, what do we owe each other? A question we could stand to ask ourselves daily in this world, given how much suffering there is in this world. He was just one of countless people I've seen since, showing extraordinary courage in extraordinary circumstances. That finally brings me back to Yulia Mamchur and that airbase in Crimea, and our dilemma about staying or going that day. That story taught me that every war is everyone's war, that the truth is fragile, and that misinformation is a dangerous weapon. I learned that it takes a village to tell a story in our complex world. And in the absence of that, in the absence of the resources correspondents need to cover stories properly, that compromise, leaving one good story for another, was unavoidable. We had no choice but to leave the colonel to his fate, to witness the start of this new conflict. And so while I learned the hard way the importance of being there, I also learned from that story the value and power of going back. And so I and many other colleagues since did go back repeatedly to East Ukraine. And we watched as protests turned to clashes, as piles of tires turned to checkpoints, and as masked gunmen became marauding militants. On one of my last trips back to Ukraine, I also tracked down Colonel Mamchur, who by then was living a quiet life near Kyiv, out of the military and out of politics and out of Crimea for good. From his decision to speak with me, like that of thousands of others I've interviewed over the years, all over the world, I learned just how powerful the human compulsion is to share our stories, even at our most difficult moments. I concluded that it's almost always a hopeful act, a wish that their story might perhaps compel someone in the world to reach across and lend a helping hand to a stranger, simply because it's the right thing to do. Bearing witness, great foreign correspondence, is also a hopeful act. Their stories, based on fact, are potent weapons, in fact, in the battle for the greater good. But the last lesson, and the biggest lesson that I learned in Ukraine, I learned that most wars never really end. Somehow it seems to me that each war I've covered continues to live on somehow, if not in unexploded bombs or in the scars they leave on forever mournful cities, then it is in our memories, in the trauma the people who lived through it carry still, sometimes passing it on from generation to generation like a family heirloom. For the past 8 years, since our trip to Crimea and then Donbass, the war in Ukraine's east never really stopped. Now it's picking up again, where we left off, when we all stopped paying attention. The evidence is on your smartphones, it's in your newspapers, on your television screens, and on the radio as we speak. Thank you for bearing witness. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Nahlah Ayed, for a captivating, informational, and inspiring talk. We will now move to the question and answer period, moderated by Professor Alison Harvey, Assistant Professor and Coordinator of Glendon's Communications Program.
you so much for that, Nahlah. That was an incredible talk. And we now have the opportunity to have a Q&A session with Nahlah. So just a reminder to all of the attendees that you can ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar screen. We already have a question from Elle Morrison to get us started here. So they thank you for the powerful analysis and want to follow up with you on the point about social media. They say, surely misinformation has flowed from the pulpits, secular as well as religious, throughout the decades. So is the difference now simply about speed and range, or is it something more substantial?
Thank you very much for that, and thanks for the question. I have to preface my answer to that by saying that I'm not an expert. I'm an observer, and I've read a lot because it interests me. And so I would consult far more knowledgeable sources on that. But my sense is that definitely it is a range. It is the ability to amplify such messages. I also think that we are more divided today. We're more polarized today than we've ever been. And that also contributes to the potency and the danger of misinformation online. I think I get the sense over the years that there is kind of a crisis of trust in authorities of all kinds. I don't know what the source of that is. Again, experts will be able to answer that better than me. But my sense is that in the disappointment that people feel about their prospects of progress and their ability to flourish and have their children flourish, that they've lost their way somehow, that they don't feel political or scientific or media authorities are representing them or ensuring their progress in life. And so I think there is something to that as well that I've noticed. It's just this real crisis of trust in authority of any kind.
It's not an easy question to answer, but I think it's really special to have your perspective on it. And it was really powerful that you started by talking about being in the Ukraine in 2014. And I was wondering, is there something about this moment in time, 2022, that would really illustrate the role and significance and importance of a foreign correspondent role?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I don't know if, I'm sure all of you would remember the first day of this conflict. The power of tuning in, for me, I mean, for those who watch television, not everybody does, but tuning in and watching our network go directly live to Kyiv to speak to our correspondent who is there now, Margaret Evans, and being able to get her impressions of what is happening on the ground, to me, is worth everything. So that's the starting point. The second is, I don't know, again, I can only speak to the CBCs and a few of the Canadian outlets and what they're doing. But the power in knowing that every one of those organizations has at least one or two people on the ground and covering different terrain. We have people in Moscow, we have people in Poland, we have people at the border watching the exodus, we have people in Lviv. I mean, I think in a moment like this, Canadians expect as wide a perspective as possible from people they trust. And the presence on the ground is what I said in my lecture as well, is the most powerful part. It's the bearing witness of the ability to walk in the street and talk to people and get their impressions and see with your own eyes the effect. That to me is the most powerful part of being a foreign correspondent, being on the ground, being there, not reading things online, actually looking with your eyes and gathering information and bringing it back to Canadians.
And it seems especially poignant given, from my perspective, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about what information you're getting on social media in terms of that disinformation campaign. And I guess I'm wondering, what is the relationship between the foreign correspondent and the way that we have this power using social media and our phones to contribute to that picture on the ground?
Such a great question, Alison, because I think that relationship is still in flux. I still think it's still being negotiated between kind of this traditional model of reporting and the citizen journalists or the people who are online, or on the ground, gathering information. So I obviously make a distinction between disinformation and the people who peddle that, and also people who just work on the ground gathering information without, organization behind them. And so that's why I mentioned that in the lecture, is that I really think I found in my reporting that having that ear to the ground online is becoming almost as important as having the eyes on the ground. It doesn't replace it, but it informs the reporting. The number of times I've learned of things from just a normal, ordinary citizen living at the right corner at the right time, who alerted me and other journalists to something that was going on. I mean, that happens on a regular basis. And that's why I say, I kind of think back to the words of, I can't remember his first name for the moment, but anyway, Kapuscinski. He used to be a Polish, very well-known Polish foreign correspondent, who's a controversial figure because he wrote, so beautifully and eloquently about the events that he covered. But one thing that he has said often when he was alive that really struck me is that journalism is kind of like a tapestry, and that you need many people to be able to help weave the story that you're telling. And so at the time in his time, it was whether television networks really had a place in telling foreign stories, because he was a magazine writer and he would write these beautiful yarns about what was going on in a particular place. But he himself, although he was a purist, felt that the more voices involved and the more ways a story is told, that the better the tapestry, the resulting tapestry is. And so I subscribe to that. I really do believe that you need that for consumers to really get everything that they want, short of traveling somewhere, that we need as foreign correspondents, perhaps as aggregators of information, we need as many sources as possible. And that includes very valuable, and I will say that from my experience, very valuable contributions from citizen journalists who are there on the ground and actually seeing things. Of course, our job is to verify. Our job is to make sure we can't just lift things and put them on the air, but we need to, those are starting points. It's just like somebody giving you a phone call in the old days and saying, hey, have you heard? So again, a tapestry of story that requires a village to put together.
It demonstrates the kind of challenges and opportunities afforded by those technologies, right? It's not like you're suggesting that social media is the root of all evil at all. Yeah. This is a real privilege for, in particular, communication students that are in attendance today. And we have a question from one of the communications alumna who has worked in reporting, Marie Gomez, who asks, do you have some advice for young journalists, especially those who might be discouraged about the lack of resources that you mentioned, and also this kind of increased desire, I suppose, in the 24/7 news cycle for content that leaves a lot more stress on journalists who already deal with a lot in their work?
Yeah. It's such a good question. Boy, yeah. Where do I begin? Lots of advice. I mean, I think it's important to remember that news goes in cycles. We go through phases. I wasn't for a while, but now I'm old enough to see that news swings. There are swings to trends and to what happens with the way we do things. Sometimes interest in world news kind of ebbs and flows. I would argue, given the moment we're in now, huge interest in foreign news. And people who haven't had bureaus in Eastern Europe are probably now considering changing that. And so I would not please take heart that, don't take it as a definitive thing that we're all out of foreign news. I really believe, I mean, even again, going back to the only example I know, the best example I know, CBC has had swings even in the time that I've been around. We don't have the Jerusalem bureau is closed, but right now we have an India bureau, which is about to open and become operational. In fact, the people who are assigned to be there are physically in India right now. So if you want to do foreign journalism, if that's the question, I think don't lose heart, but I think the opportunities will be there. In terms of the workload, it's a work in progress on my part as well. And so, so take this for what it's worth. It is not easy to balance the demands of a foreign correspondent's job and a life. It is not easy to produce the various versions that you need to serve a broadcaster, let's say, like the CBC. And so you have to go in with your eyes open, and you have to go in with a mentality of problem solving. And that's when people say, what did you do for a living? I always say, I used to problem solve, because really for nearly 20 years, it was about how do I get, these 18 versions, I'm exaggerating a little bit, of this story on time to the shows that need it. So it requires ingenuity, it requires recycling material, it requires again, it requires a village. I couldn't possibly have been able to do it without the help of the producers and the cameramen and women and the videographers and editors who all contribute, who will take bits of video and audio and help me kind of realize the mission, which is to get as much of this information on as many platforms as possible. It's hard. I would recommend you don't do it for 20 years. That's my other recommendation.
I thank you for that acknowledgement of the below the line labor that happens, right? With the, sometimes it's like the hero or heroine for foreign correspondent, and it doesn't reveal that, the village behind it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You probably can't see the chat right now because you're busy focusing. There's a lot of people thanking you and commending the discussion. So this question starts by saying thanks for the talk, and they had chills listening to you speak because you helped us to see where we are in history right now and what we might look back on, and also how to think about acting in this moment. So the question is, in addition to bearing witness to world events, do you have any other suggestions as to how to help others as we witness these world events?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a question we get a lot. I mean, as I said, the minimum is bearing witness, and it's hard for me to be prescriptive, partly because it's not what I do, but what I can tell you that people do. Here's an example. I mean, this is when I got chills about the kind of difference that bearing witness can make. I mentioned the Rohingya story. It had been unfolding for a few weeks before we finally got there. I was watching it on BBC and other bigger networks that had people there. So I finally got there, and again was so floored by the scenes that I saw and the people we spoke to. So were Canadians. So Canadians were, the people who were watching us were floored. And I don't remember ever getting that much mail. What I also don't remember ever is that it actually led to the government, just a few days later, as we started reporting, to match funds, which it's doing, I believe, right now with Ukraine, match anybody's funding who wants to contribute, to help these refugees on the ground. And so there was quite a groundswell of people who gave money and who gave their time volunteering, or those kinds of things. Am I counseling you do that? That's your decision. I wouldn't counsel anyone to do anything. But it is definitely sort of the next line of response that I've observed in Canadians whenever a big story like this happens. Also, when we've had people in Sudan, for example, in Darfur, when those incredible stories of hardship and poverty also again led the government to match funds and Canadians to open their wallets and to give money. So that's definitely one of the responses that I've seen. Others like to raise awareness and bear witness and pass it on, kind of thing. So that's what I've seen people do. So those are a couple of options.
Thank you. Someone's asked a question that I wondered too, because you talk a lot about very sobering moments in history, and they're kind of continuous as well. And some people have the option to just back away from the news. You hear about that all the time, but that's not a possibility for someone in your role. So how do you keep a positive perspective moving forward? And the question also asks, or do you?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's again, I defer to Karoloff, who is just so articulate in explaining this this battle that we all have between the hope of reporting the stories and the despondency that it makes no difference. And I will tell you, it's a good question you asked, that I oscillated all those years between those two extremes, and of course some points in between. I cannot definitively say that I have no hope, and I cannot definitively say that I see, a beautiful clear sky ahead. There's always gray in this. And so I think the possibility that the examples I gave you, the fact that sometimes our reporting, sometimes a story like what we're seeing now galvanizes people, or the story of the crisis in the refugee crisis in Europe galvanized Canadians to sign up and to privately sponsor these refugees. Those kinds of stories really, they give me a lot of mileage. Like it keeps you going a bit longer, and you think, yeah, actually there is a point to this. There is something positive and actionable about the stories we do. But it is also, I mean, especially now, we are also distracted, and also the world is a heavy place. I mean, this is where I go back to Carol. Carol talks about, the need for people to protect themselves from, the heavy toll of these horrible things that happen everywhere. And so, no, it's hard to expect everyone to be able to watch the news every day. I can't do it. I mean, it's too distressing. But that's why she says stay engaged. I don't think it means daily. I think it means stay engaged to the extent that you can, and stay knowledgeable and stay informed, and go to the sources you trust. I think that's really important. And in a time like this today, I think it's enough to say that we know what's going on and that we can watch the odd newscast and have a sense of what is happening on that other side of the world, and whether there is anything that could be done to help.
It's almost like not being a passive, like doom scroller of the news, what you're saying too.
Precisely.
Yeah, I like
that. And to pick your moments, because we're all human. And I know my own parents stopped watching the news, because they got depressed. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that only you know how much you can handle. But I really do think, given the interconnectedness that we live and the desire to have a better world, should make it really hard for any of us to turn off completely. That's what I'm saying. Does it mean watching every day? No, it just means stay engaged.
Someone wants to know how you got to become a foreign correspondent. Was there a personal connection to the profession?
Oh, wow. I wish. No, I mean, I guess it's personal in some senses, but I was just I shouldn't say a boring old, because I'm not boring, that's for sure, but I was a boring old political reporter, a very junior one in Ottawa, actually, when September 11th happened. And I thought about being a foreign correspondent, but it wasn't sort of immediately on my mind until 9/11 happened. And a couple of people kind of said, so what are you going to do? I mean, this is a moment where us and them have a fight going on, and you happen to speak the language of one of them. What are you going to do? And so I thought about it, and I ended up in Afghanistan, and really, really loved doing the work. And so I decided, in fact, it had just preceded that. I had met Neil MacDonald, for those who remember him. I met him on a trip to the Middle East with the former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, and he himself also planted the seed and said, why aren't you working in the Middle East? And I said, well, I'm a political reporter. Anyway, long story short, I went back to Neil and said, so remember what you suggested. Any chance you can introduce me to somebody? I just met him, I didn't know him. But any chance you could introduce me to the bosses and see if they'd be interested if I went to the Middle East and freelanced? And just so happened they were interested. So I started as a freelancer, and Iraq kicked off, and I became staff, and here we are.
I think students often want to know how you get jobs, and it's really useful to hear about. Some of it is about meeting people along the way. It's not necessarily a vision you have at the beginning.
It's true, but if I may just actually add one more thing, if that's the question, it actually precedes that, in that I was interested in international news. There's no doubt. I mean, I grew up in a household that was international, and the news every night was, required viewing. But it started at university. Like, my interest in journalism started, I was still a genetics student, and I started freelancing and actually got a little tiny paid job at the student newspaper. And that's where I often say to students, don't ignore the stuff that you do on the side, and not to at all take away from programs where we pay lots of money to learn something, but don't pay attention to what you gravitate towards, because ultimately here I am. And it started with a few articles at the University of Manitoba. So it's just something to keep in mind.
You heard it from Nahlah Ayed. So there is a lot of interest, I guess, in this question of social media and traditional journalism. And having taught about news for a long time, the problems began before so-called fake news, right? The defunding of the newsroom, for instance. So someone asked, do you think that the kind of traditional news values, like about objectivity and, the other kind of journalistic principles that are in place have been irreparably degraded by these new media channels, like social media platforms? Or is there some more to it?
Mm-hmm. I don't subscribe to the idea that they've been irreparably degraded. I think in a good way, they've been reevaluated. I think I'm sure all of you know, because you're students involved in communications and journalism, that there's been this debate over the word objectivity and what it really means. The fact is that, as my colleague Tom Howell told very eloquently in a show, which I'll plug on ideas about bias, that we all have biases. The question is, how does that play into what we do to serve our audiences, which is our job, right? So I think the conversation between the citizen journalists of the world and social media and the proliferation of opinion really is what we're talking about. And it's rivaling, the quote unquote objective news. I think it's forced us to reckon with that word objectivity and try to redefine what it is, what we're trying to do. And the CBC actually has come up with, we're still having the conversation, of course, but the CBC has come up with what I think is a good alternative to that. So objectivity, that word it seems to be over and done with. So really what we look at is to ensure that every single story we tell is fair, balanced, and accurate. And so you might have a bias, but then you've got, as I said, a village helping you do this story. And between all of you, if you can't come up with a fair, accurate, and balanced story, then there's a problem. Then you're not doing your job. And so I think social media has presented a challenge to traditional media. It has upended the model that we have known for so many years, but ultimately it's a good thing because it acknowledges that we're all human. It acknowledges that no one has, what's the word, like a monopoly over the truth or over stories, that all together we can come up with what the truth is. But it's modernized the way we think about covering stories. I really do think so. It's still a tug of war, though. It is a tug of war.
And then there is, like, I guess, a relationship between those, what people commonly call bias or subjectivity, and trust. And someone has asked,
Sure.
How can we, I guess, the question is, how do we kind of develop more trust in journalism? Like, how do we get to a place where there's like less, I suppose, suspicion and worries around what is the information that's being presented to us?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a two-way street. I think it's important if your hope is to have more trust in journalism organizations like ours, then you need to tell us when you don't feel trust and why. So that's one way. The critique, a reasoned critique, I think is incredibly important to, especially a public broadcaster. And you'll be happy to know we do get a lot of critique, and much of it is reasoned, and we listen. The other way is our reevaluation of what we do. I mean, I will tell you that we have had some very fruitful conversations in-house on how do we get across to people, hey, beyond saying that, hey, just trust us, how do we illustrate to people that we're trustworthy? And one of the ways we're really banking on is transparency, i.e. when we are out in the field and we're doing something, we like to tell people what we're doing. So if we do, let's say, a fact check or like a myth busting of some kind, then we explain how we did it. Who do we talk to? What's the process? What's our threshold for something being true or not? How did we verify a video? Did we do geolocating? What organizations have we talked to? Bellingcat, all these different places that now make it their business to do to verify videos, for example, that we find online. So I think it's is it the only thing? No, but I think the frontline tool for us to try to foster more trust is to tell people what we do and how we do it, and to bring them into it, make people participants in the process too. So that's a starting point.
That sounds amazing. I think it would be very educational for people too, to understand all the processes that you go through. It's not just speaking into a camera. There's a difficult question, and I think it's really interesting. Someone has brought up kind of the differential reporting on refugees from Ukraine versus refugees from other conflicts that are happening in this exact moment. And there appears to be a relationship to, visa issuing as well. And I think it goes a little bit to the us versus them as well that you mentioned, right? Like people are literally saying, these are blonde people with blue eyes, and so that's why it chimes more. I mean, is there a relationship between recency in journalism and, these kinds of differential treatments that we're seeing in the world right now?
Just what was the word, recency?
Yeah, I guess like this is what's happening right now, so we're talking about it, whereas like the conflict in Yemen is like longer standing.
So what's the question again?
I guess, how do you react to this kind of differential reporting?
Yeah. How do I react to that differential reporting? I have definitely seen the comments online. It's hard not to. How do I react? I think, as journalists, we're not players in what's happening on the ground. We have to report what we see. And is it a fact that Ukrainian refugees are being treated differently than the influx of refugees from another continent, from another country? I mean, we're seeing that. That is a fact. So that's a reportable fact. As for the reasons behind it, I think what we need to do is be analysts. We need to study it and analyze it. So why is this going on? So absolutely, there are people who are saying, well, look, these guys are Ukrainians are Christian, white, and they are of the continent, therefore they're being welcomed, and the others are not. That is going on. We know that. To answer the question why requires more than a couple of minutes of sitting, giving conjecture from a country or a continent away. I'd want to be on the ground and to talk to people and to do a report based on that. Why is this happening? I mean, can we call it racism? Can we call it, well, these are people from the continent, so we're welcoming them in. I can't make pronouncements about the motivation behind something without actually being there and talking to people. Did I notice it? Yes. Are people angry about it? Yes. Is it a fact? Yes. So why? I'd love to actually, if you're an assignment editor and you gave me that story, I'd love to go cover it.
Maybe we'll hear about it on Ideas.
That's actually, yeah, maybe it started here.
There's a lot of, like, because you brought up so many interesting things, it's very tempting to ask you to answer everything, like what should we do about misinformation and stuff like that. But we are starting to run out of time. So I was wondering if I could ask this question. I think it's very interesting because we've been talking about we are all subjects in the world. And the question is, in a world that's marked by race and gender inequalities, how do you negotiate your own social location as a journalist who's also a racialized woman?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not easy depending on where you are, of course. I mean, I often talk about this, and I wrote about it in my book, is that I spent a good chunk of my time reporting in the Middle East trying to escape who I was. Because if I acknowledged who I was, then I would be seen as a participant, which is often, I think it's the power of a foreign correspondent is not to be that. Not using the word objective, I'm just saying, be as neutral as possible and not be part of the story. And so I spent a lot of that time kind of just reminding people, especially in the Middle East, that I come at this as a Canadian journalist, and no, I'm sorry, I don't have an opinion on this or that. And so that it's a hard thing to do, because then you're not being yourself. So how do I come at this now? I mean, I think the only way to do it, and certainly I did this when I got older and learned a bit more and could be more comfortable in my own skin, is that there is no escaping who I am. I am Canadian. I'm from Winnipeg, born and raised. I am a woman, and I am of Palestinian Arab descent. And that is just a fact. And I think as I approach every single one of my stories, which is with the greatest amount of care and respect and understanding, that I would hope, and I have hoped and approached stories hoping that people would look at me the same way. But I think honesty, again, going back to honesty and transparency, is the only way to navigate being in the world as who you are. You have to be who you are. And so that has been my way of dealing with it, is just to be transparent. And being a woman, being of racialized background excludes you from certain scenes. It excludes you from certain roles. I mean, I've certainly been pigeonholed for many, many years as the Middle East correspondent, when my interests are far wider than that. And so people would tend to want to put you in boxes. And I think it's important to be transparent, not just about who you are, but about your desire not to be seen in boxes. And so I've spent the last many, many years ensuring that's the case. And frankly, I'm so privileged. I'm incredibly privileged. I'm racialized and a woman, but I'm super privileged. And I'm now working at this incredible show called Ideas, where not only do we see the whole world, but we look at ideas from around the world. And I feel seen that way, in that I'm interested in all of it. So yeah, it's a lifelong process.
Thank you so much. So the last question I think I'm going to ask you, because so many people are interested in the question of misinformation and trust, because you mentioned trusted sources. I think people are really interested in knowing, like, where do you go? What do you have, sources, writers that you're particularly inspired by, or practices that you're particularly inspired by that you would like to share with their students? There's teachers, there's all kinds of people here. We'd love to know that.
You mean sources in general, or this story, or?
Yeah, I guess they said trusted sources or writers that you look up to, or whose practices you're inspired by.
Oh my God, wait, well, we need another hour to answer that question. I'm happy to share a list with you. I'm like, God, I mean, who do I name right now? I mean, I can start naming names. I think I'd like to share a list with you, so I will. But there are people who I've watched for many, many years, whose work I have always trusted. Let me just throw a couple out. Mark McKinnon at the Globe and Mail is someone who's covered the Ukraine story since he was born. And so there's someone who really knows what he's talking about when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And he speaks Russian and has lived in Russia. There is a point I like to make in all my discussions about foreign correspondence, is the importance and the value of being there in between. I mentioned that in the lecture, and not just when violence breaks out, or when these spikes of violence kind of come out of nowhere. And Mark and others like him is someone who lived in Russia, who was in Ukraine repeatedly, went back 100 times, and really that adds to this tapestry that I was telling you about, that promises to serve us well. So I admire journalists who have spent the time, and by the way, not to denigrate those who haven't, because it's not up to us as individual correspondents what happens and whether we can live in a place. It's up to our bosses and our organizations and the amount of money we have. So, but still, I admire reporters, organizations that have people on the ground in places that matter. And so I'd be happy to share a list of others like Mark, who have done the hard work, because in a way it's almost not easy, but it's easier to cover a breaking story. It's a lot harder to be in the middle, learning all the nuances of a culture and people and languages so that you can tell your next story better.
Thank you so much, Nahlah, for your time today and for answering these questions. There are more questions than there are time, but there's also a book that people can read. I wanted to just share with you one comment that someone said, thanking you for your perspective, thanking you for your book, thanking you for your field work. Bearing witness to the suffering is something, that this person manages in healthcare too, and it's very difficult. And so she says, from a long-term nurse, news junkie, and CBC listener, thank you. Glad that you're currently at CBC Ideas. I think that's a sentiment we can all share. So yeah, thank you so much today, Nahlah.
Thank you for the wonderful questions, and thank you to this wonderful nurse who's doing really courageous work, and to all health workers. But yeah, it's been absolutely a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for moderating the Q&A section. Thank you, Nahlah Ayed. Thank you for reminding us that we cannot be indifferent to conflict, war, injustice, inequality, and so on, reminding us that every war is our war. Thank you for taking us as an international correspondent to all these wonderful places around the world, even if they're sad and problematic. Thank you for telling us stories about Syria, Yemen, Sweden, Russia, Ukraine, Thailand, India, I mean, the list goes on, Lebanon, my home country. Thank you finally for telling us, reminding us that in every conflict, birds still sing. At the end, I would like to ask you, Nahlah, to read the names of the 10 lucky winners who will receive a complimentary copy of your book, 1,000 Farewells, A Reporter's Journey from a Refugee Camp to the Arab Spring.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to wrap this up. I appreciate it. Yes, I have a list of winners here who will get a copy of the book. So I'll read them. Margaret Drent, Melik Nassar, Marigold Bandari, Sheila Purdy, Yasmin Bhatia, Louise Sauvé-Dubois, Donald Walker, Mila Panik, Hamish Greenland, and Amal Attar Guzman. Congratulations. And if we run into each other at some stage, I'd be happy to sign it.
Thank you, Nahlah. I just want to mention that the Glendon School of Public and International Affairs is organizing an event on the subject of Ukraine, Putin, and the impact on international security. The event, taking place this Thursday, March 3rd from 3 to 5 p.m., will feature guest speaker Susan Pond, former NATO executive. This event will be in English and will include a Q&A period. Les participants sont invités à poser les questions en français. Be sure to register to obtain your Zoom link. The link is glendon.yorku.ca, GSBIA. Finally, I want to thank our dear guests for their participation and for attending the Holmes Lecture. I want to thank the graduate students from Glendon's Master of Conference Interpreting for providing the interpretation services today. I want to thank all the event organizers for all their hard work. And finally, a very big thank you, Nahlah Ayed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that concludes our session today.